One of the most turbulent times in medieval England saw a civil war erupt over who would be the rightful king. The Wars of the Roses brought bloodshed to the country, and there were many different battles fought between the House of York and the House of Lancaster. Eventually the Wars of the Roses would come to a bloody end, with one of England's most notorious kings, Richard III, slain on the battlefield, and then his body was taken on a cart into the city of Leicester to be displayed. The people of England knew their king had been defeated, and this signalled the beginning of the Tudor period, the most notorious era in English history, with kings such as King Henry VIII and queens such as Bloody Mary I ruling. But one of the biggest losers of the Wars of the Roses was a man who had reigned a long time throughout his life, and he was a king who would have two reigns during his life. King Henry VI reigned from 1422 to 1461, and then again for a year in 1470. However, the Lancastrian ruler would be slaughtered inside of the Tower of London, and what happened to him and his fate is often debated, but it's mostly accepted by historians that he was murdered inside of the chapel whilst he was vulnerable and praying. Join us today as we look at the slaughter of the forgotten King of England, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. King Henry VI was the son of the victor of Agincourt, Henry V, a man who is often talked about as being one of England's greatest kings, and his mother was Catherine of Valois, a French princess who came to England following negotiations of marriage. But King Henry VI would not know his father, who died whilst he was abroad fighting during the 100 Years' War. However, Henry VI would be crowned King of England in 1429, and he was made the King of France in 1431. A regency council would rule for him for some time, as Henry was too young, and these would guide the king for his first few years. But in 1445 he married Margaret of Anjou, and Henry was a very religious and pious man who would be known for choosing the wrong company. He would select advisors who gave him poor counsel and advice, and there were many different power struggles inside of his court. For a king as a young man to rule over one kingdom was difficult, let alone two kingdoms, England and France, and dual ruling would become very tricky and hard to maintain. It was during the young king's reign that the French began to fight back during the 100 Years' War, and Joan of Arc would lead a number of French successes, and in 1450 Normandy was lost to the French, which negatively affected the reputation of Henry VI. But in 1453 Henry had a mental breakdown, and during this time Richard the Duke of York was named the Protector of England. He did recover, but then civil war broke out in England, and the Wars of the Roses erupted, pitting the houses of York and Lancaster against each other, and there was a struggle for supremacy between the two. In 1460 the Duke of York was killed at the Battle of Wakefield, and his son would continue the fight for the Yorkists, and he would defeat the Lancastrians at the Battle of Tewkesbury, a very bloody battle, and this son was then crowned King Edward IV. Edward was the real victor behind the Wars of the Roses, and he would later on regain supremacy and rule over England well. But following Edward's crowning, Henry VI fled into exile, and he would come back to England and would be captured by Edward. When he was captured, Henry was paraded throughout London in front of his people. His feet were tied to a horse, and he wore a straw hat and was said to have been a rebel, and for Henry, the former king, this must have been incredibly humiliating. But then his fortunes would change as the Earl of Warwick, Richard Neville, also known as Warwick Kingmaker, defected sides, and he would turn on Edward IV and would manage to restore Henry VI onto the throne in 1470. Edward later came back from exile and defeated the Lancastrians in the Battle of Tewkesbury in May 1471 and was proclaimed king yet again, and Henry VI's son was killed in this battle. But following being displaced off the throne yet again, Henry VI would be held inside of the Tower of London, which was at the time a royal residence, but it was now a place where a king would be held under lock and key. It's believed that he had a rather decent imprisonment, but things would change, as he would on the 21st of May 1471 be reported to have died. The official chronicles and documents state Henry died on this day, and it's likely that Henry's enemies kept him alive for a while, as they may have feared his son Edward more as a ruler, but with him out of the question and dead, Henry was seen as a weaker ruler and leader for the Lancastrian forces. According to the history of the arrival of Edward IV, a chronicle favouring Edward, it was said that Henry died of what was described as pure displeasure and melancholy, meaning that he died from depression or heartbreak following the news of the Battle of Tewkesbury and hearing that his son had been killed. But it's more likely that there was a more sinister cause of death for Henry VI, and one which was more brutal. It's believed that Richard the Duke of Gloucester, who would later seize the throne for himself and become known as King Richard III, may have been behind the murder of the former king and may have had some knowledge about this. It's believed that Henry, whilst he was praying inside of the small chapel in the Wakefield Tower in the Tower of London, he was struck by an assassin, and that he may have also even been stabbed by someone who was sent to do the king's work of killing the former monarch. He would probably have been hit by something incredibly heavy and repeatedly, and it's believed that the scene was an absolute bloodbath. To have Henry alive for Edward IV was risky, and he posed a threat for as long as he remained alive. There is a plaque today inside of the chapel, which is in front of the altar, which marks the spot where Henry VI was killed. There are conflicting reports about the specific time of death, and Thomas More, the Tudor scholar, would later allude to the fact that Richard III killed Henry himself whilst he was vulnerable and in a place of God. But this could have been propaganda, to further make Richard III seem like a slaughterous tyrant and murderer who should never have been king, justifying the Tudors' right to rule. Following his murder or death, Henry VI was originally buried inside of Chertsey Abbey, but then for some reason Richard III had Henry's body moved to St George's Chapel in Windsor. After his death it was said that a number of miracles occurred at his tomb, including one in which a plague victim was raised from the dead as she was being stitched into a shroud, and many people flocked to the gravesite to be cured and to pay their respects to the former king. But this did not please Richard III, and during the reign of Henry VII, the king began to build a chapel at Westminster Abbey, which would house the relics of the dead king. In 1910, the body of Henry VI was discovered when builders were doing work inside of the royal vaults. The coffin was opened, and it was found that Henry was 5 feet 9 inches tall, and his light hair was found which was covered in blood, and there was severe damage caused to his skull, indicating that the former king met a very bloody end with a terrifying act of violence. But Henry VI was a king who was born to rule, and was born onto the throne, and he was born into a turbulent situation where he would dual rule as the King of England and France. But during his reign, much of the French territory was lost, and he became a rather unpopular figure. But he would be deposed a number of times in a civil war that saw neighbours pitted against each other. But his death and demise was met with brutality and horror, as he would be one of the earliest victims of the Tower of London, which would in the decades later become a place synonymous with torture and execution. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.